Hello, welcome to Book Club with Jeffrey Sachs. Today I'm absolutely delighted to have as our guest one of the leading political scientists of geopolitics in the world today, in my opinion, Professor Glenn Diesen, who is professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. He's written a very important book, a very helpful book for people to read, to understand the dynamics of global change and the reasons for the Ukraine war. The book is called The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. Glenn, thank you so much for coming on Book Club. It's great to be with you.
No, thank you. It's a great privilege to be on your book club. So thanks again.
Well, you're watching events, in my view, with a clarity and a perspective and knowledge of Russia, Western Europe, the United States, the world that is very, very rare. And therefore, I think you get things so right and help us to understand these events in a very important way. And I want to add, the book is very clearly written, so it's a great text also for teachers that are aiming to teach international relations, but teach it the right way, not from a very biased way, but from an international way. So I want to help the listeners to understand your book, why you wrote it, what it means. And I want to start with a very basic point, which is foundational for the book. The book is entitled The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. What is a world order? Because that's the centerpiece of your analysis. I agree with it completely, but I think it's a concept that is not perhaps well understood because it's not an intuitive concept. It's only if you study history that you can see that concept.
Well, I defined world order as consisting mainly of two components. So one would be the international distribution of power and the rules that gives it legitimacy. So world order is effectively the rules we have. And if we really go back to defining the modern world order, it has to be at the Peace of Westphalia, as this is when the world order was established according to the international anarchy. So there was, instead of having one hegemon, we had then many centers of power. So if any one state would seek hegemony, the others would then collectively balance it. And the rules or that legitimize it kind of reflects this balance of power. So it promotes a sovereign equality, for example, for the main actors. And this is what we always had. But as we know, there was a huge disruption after the Cold War.
So before we jump to the Cold War, actually, I want to make sure that people are following the basic concepts, because the audience is very diverse. It's not international relations specialists. We talk about all sorts of issues of politics, sustainable development, climate, geography, history, culture, and so on. So to come back to the first of these world orders that you described, of course, it wasn't really a world order, it was a European order. And you call it the Order of the Peace of Westphalia. The Westphalian Peace was the treaty that ended the European 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, and it concluded with the Treaty of Westphalia. And that treaty gave certain recognition to independent sovereign states at the time. They could be kingdoms or principalities and so forth. But the Treaty of Westphalia ended what was a very bloody war of religions, in part between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, but it had many other dimensions to it also, geographical, historical. It was a really bloody war in Europe. And what is the what came out of the Treaty of 1648? Because we refer to it a lot, that we're in a Westphalian system. This is something that a student in international relations would hear repeatedly, since it's a treaty that is almost 400 years old now. What did it say, and why do we regard it as a core benchmark of the modern system?
Well, it effectively set up the system as having been based on international anarchy. Now, when we say international anarchy, it sounds very chaotic, but the only thing it means effectively is that there's no world government. So every state is, well, effectively on its own. And this has set out the main challenge we also have in international security, that is the security competition. So if country A increases its security, it tends to come at the expense of country B. So this is really how the main reason why we have these conflicts. And I just want to add, one of the reasons why we ended up with this system was because of the 30 years war. As you mentioned, no one state was able to establish dominance to become a new hegemon. And this, every time it seemed like one state might prevail, the others began to balance it. And it showed that the values of the Catholics, for example, the French were willing to go against the Habsburgs and align themselves with Protestant Sweden just to prevent the Habsburgs from dominating. So it showed that we didn't really have that many universal values anymore that legitimized the hegemon. So the distribution of power no longer favored a hegemon, and legitimacy for ruling over others also no longer existed after the Reformation. So for this reason, we ended up then with an international system with many centers of power, and this has usually been the main challenge in world order. That is, we either have a balance of power or we lean towards one state dominating, and this is the main tensions we have.
So you go through several world orders, which are, to some extent, at least the first couple, are mainly European orders, because China and India and so forth don't really show up as part of the story. Say in the Westphalian Treaty, this was really about continental Europe.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but yes, because before you did mention that the Westphalian is world order, but you're very correct. It was a European system, but because the Europeans from there on began to dominate the world, it was effectively imposed on the rest. However,
right.
It was not, the sovereign equality was a foundation between the states of Europe, but it was a European system. So sovereignty was deemed to be, only civilized states were considered to have the responsibility to be sovereign. So that meant European, Christian countries. So the rest of the world fell then under what's referred to as the jungle or uncivilized, which meant they did not have the responsibility capable of being responsible for sovereignty. This was the assumption. So it created an international system based on sovereign inequality because, exactly as you said, it was a European system.
Then the second world order that you describe is at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe. So could you say what happens between 1648 and 1815? This second order, if I have it correctly in your chronology.
Yeah, well, obviously we have the Napoleonic Wars. So after the French Revolution, the French have their own format of idealist internationalism. So they will effectively try to use universal values to legitimize their dominance across Europe. And this is one effort to overcome the international anarchy by establishing one dominant force. And as we know, this was defeated, and by 1815 we went with a new world order, which is then the Concert of Europe, and it lasted all the way from the end of the Napoleonic Wars until the First World War. And it's also quite interesting because it it recognized the need to preserve this balance of power by actually bringing in the French. So the defeated power still had a seat at the table. So there was no effort to perpetuate the weakness of the defeated state who was, evil or something. Instead, they recognized this pragmatism that this is a world order based on balance of power, and the French were an important part of this. So
So the idea is in revolutionary France and as led by Napoleon, France said, we have the right ideas, liberty, equality, fraternity. We're going to spread French revolutionary values everywhere. Britain said, no, thank you. We will oppose you. We will fight you. We will align with other countries, maybe with very different political systems, the Russian Empire, the Habsburgs, and so forth. And we will balance France and ultimately defeat Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815. After that, then the major powers said, we need to keep the peace. So it was more than anarchy. It was a kind of, it is called a concert of Europe, which included Britain, France, Prussia, until Germany was unified, the Habsburg Empire, and Russia. And these empires were to be in concert to stabilize Europe and actually to prevent revolutions, to prevent Marxist revolutions or popular revolutions or, God forbid, democracy as well in countries. And that was the idea of this second world order. So that brings us to the third world order, because that world order, as you say, continued for a century, basically, from 1815, the year of Waterloo, the defeat of Napoleon, to 1914, the year of the outbreak of World War I. Interpret for us why World War I happened if there was a concert of Europe, and then what was the world order that emerged out of that disaster?
Well, I argue that the concert of Europe began to weaken already at the end of the 19th century, given that you had all this development of peacetime alliances. And it's important to realize that peacetime alliances can be quite destructive. It can be a useful tool during war to balance a hegemon, but during peacetime they have a tendency to undermine the principle of indivisible security. So instead, they promote the security of some at the expense of others. So you have the formation then of different alliance systems, and also a key aspect which you saw throughout the Cold War. The 19th century as well was after the Napoleonic Wars. It was a bit of a strange victory for the Russians, because yes, they defeated Napoleon, but they ended the rivalry between the French and the British, and then they effectively began to ally as well against the Russians. Towards in the beginning of the 20th century, we saw that this began to fall apart, and you have then these alliances building up against each other.
I think one of the factors that's very important and familiar to us today is that the initial concert of Europe was based on not only a system, but based on the relative power of the countries at the time. And Britain was predominant, but in the oceans, not on the continent. And the powers on the continent were roughly in balance. By the end of the 19th century, there was one very marked development, and that is Germany became a major industrial power. And Russia was starting to industrialize rapidly as well by the end of the 19th century. And with the rise of Germany, the German leadership, if I'm not mistaken, Kaiser Wilhelm II, began to view Germany as not in concert with Britain, but as the rival to Britain. Why should Britain have all that hegemony and power? We are now the major industrial force. We're actually a larger economy. He dismissed the great genius of balance of power, Bismarck, and embarked on a competition with Britain, a naval arms race, actually, which was definitely destabilizing. At the same time, Russia was developing, and Germany was afraid of that huge country to its east starting to be a threat to Germany. So am I correct that the changing economics led to new fears and new instability? So what had been a balance of power became an imbalance of power.
Yeah, very much so, because it's important to realize that the German states, there were many weaker ones, and this effectively functioned as a buffer to some extent between some of these great powers. But you're very correct, with the unification of Germany in 1871, it suddenly instead created this very powerful state, which began to disrupt it. And again, Bismarck was great at geopolitics, but he had a tendency to dismiss the need for the balance of power as well. So, and you saw the economic rise of Germany, which was quite spectacular. It often was measured at the time in, for example, steel production. But you saw suddenly Germany beginning in 1871, very much weaker than Britain. And by 1814, it has overtaken Britain.
1914.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. In 1914, that overtaken the British. So effectively, what you had was a very powerful Germany locked in a Europe which was British dominated. It's a little bit like having Asia run by, or the United States with China, which is more economically powerful. It simply outgrew the system, the regional system, and this began to create tensions. And even the Germans, they created this, because they had prospered somewhat under the Napoleonic system, the continental system. So they began to recreate some of these things, like the German customs union. And but they kept having tensions because they never had the physical infrastructure to connect with the rest of the world, which is probably why the Chinese also have their Belt and Road Initiative, because the Germans tried to access the seas to have reliable transportation corridors. The British were able to counter this. They wanted to have railroads going into the Middle East from Berlin to Baghdad. This also threatened the Russians, the French, and the British colonialist interests. So it began to really disrupt all the major, the major powers. And so this obviously built up to the collapse of this entire system.
One episode that I very much like, if it's true and not apocryphal, is that the Kaiser, on the verge of dismissing Bismarck, says we need to build the Navy to compete with Britain, and Bismarck is not interested in building the Navy, and the Kaiser supposedly says to him, but what if the British land on our shores in the North Sea? And Bismarck's answer is, well, then I will arrest them. He's completely downplaying the real risks. But of course, the Kaiser dismissed Bismarck, went on a major armaments buildup. As you said, the alliances hardened, secret alliances, open alliances, and then the two sides clashed and went to this disastrous war in 1914. So talk us through, between 1914 and 1945, there was only world disorder, I assume. I don't think that we could say that there's a new world order until after World War II.
No, they tried to establish this League of Nations, but obviously by this point you have a huge disruption in the international distribution of power. But on top of this as well, you have more ideological rivalries beginning as well. So obviously the Russians had turned to, well, the Soviets at the time then, provided ideological alternatives. So overall, this was a very disruptive period. So, and also the new system which was put in place after the First World War, it didn't reflect anymore the realities or the sensibilities we had after the Napoleonic Wars, because when Germany was defeated, much like the French had been, instead of giving them a seat at the table, there was the assumption that they would have to be, the weakness would have to be perpetuated, because again, having this powerful Germany in the center of Europe without reliable access to international markets and the rest of the world, it would always put it in conflict with other powers as it tried to break out from this containment. So this attempt to perpetuate the weakness of Germany really laid the foundation for the next World War. And
in other words, just to also put it in context, the treaty that ended the First World War, the Versailles Treaty, was a very harsh peace vis-a-vis Germany. Germany was punished with huge burdens of reparations payments, war blame, and great restrictions. John Maynard Keynes, who was my hero as a political economist, kind of the kind of economist that I most admired as I was a student and learning economics, who could look at politics and look at economics and join them together, wrote a book of great disgruntlement after having been on the British commission to the negotiations of the Versailles Treaty. That book was hugely influential for me, called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And Keynes said, these terms are so onerous against Germany, they will lead, unless changed, to a massive political backlash in the future, and the specter of war will haunt us, and we will face disaster in the next generation. And indeed, he called that exactly correctly.
But a key lesson from this as well, because I mentioned before the idealist internationalism of the French revolutionaries. We, to some extent, saw this as well in the from the Wilsonian government. Of course, one can talk about the Bolsheviks as well, but from the United States, we saw Wilson arguing that this war was the war to make the world safe for democracy. He effectively also made it a civilizing mission almost, or emboldening effectively crusader mentality to some extent. So instead of being a very great example at the time to be the United States to be copied by the rest of the world, he instead took it from a passiveness to be emulated to more active, to go out in the world to make it safe. And it was also this contrast that if you really believe that the democracies would keep the peace, and the Germans were the opposite, they were the Huns, these were the the brutal ones, then this was a good way of mobilizing the public against the Germans by presenting this as a struggle between good and evil. But the problem then as well was that workable peace, which was many opportunities for, were rejected, instead had to be fought to the end. And once the Germans were defeated, it also incentivized this very extraordinary and punitive peace settlement, in which Germany was to be kept weak forever because it was this German problem. So it again, as we can see, this is also a problem we have today.
It is very much relevant to our discourse today, which we'll get to shortly. Again, a U.S. vision of there's good, that's us, there's evil, that's them, and it's all a battle of good and evil. And in a way, I guess we are still speaking Wilson's language. Woodrow Wilson, the president during World War I, that took the U.S. into World War I in order to make the world safe for democracy and so forth. And as you point out, ironically, it created the conditions for a treaty that was the opposite. It's the Versailles Treaty, sometimes called the peace to end all peace, because it was a peace agreement that ended the possibility of peace and led to the Second World War within one generation. So let's take the story, if we can, up to the end of the Second World War. Of course, Hitler rose to power in the chaotic environment of the Great Depression and the backlash and the claim that Germany had been stabbed in the back, and the harsh Versailles Treaty was viewed as a cause for German revenge. Hitler led the world to utter disaster of the Second World War. Tens of millions of people died in that war. 1945, the war ends. The United States, UK, and Russia, in an alliance, have defeated Hitler's Germany. What comes next in terms of the world order then?
Well, let me just say, one of the lessons as well, as I mentioned before, with this good versus evil, actually Hans Morgenthau, he wrote in the 1940s that about this warning, a caution, if you will, that if we see the world as being countries with national interest, we create peace through mutual understanding and compromise. But he warned about the dangerous morality as it could fuel these crusader missions, in which if it's good versus evil, peace is not created through mutual understanding. You don't understand the evil, instead you defeat it. So peace is created when good defeats evil, as compromising with evil is effectively appeasement. So this is obviously, just to point out why it's very dangerous.
No, very important, because I think it explains what happens starting in 1945. And by the way, exactly in 1945, the war had barely ended when a new war, Cold War, erupted. Take us through that, because that brings us up to the story that leads to the Ukraine war, which is central to your book.
Yeah, well, we were able to establish the United Nations, obviously, so one international system which was based on the modern world order. That is, it's a balance of power between sovereign equals. However, it also created two worlds, because it was a bipolar world. So you had the West versus the East, and it's important that in this era, which we now refer to as the liberal international system, it existed because of a very unique situation. That is, there was one center of power, economic power, in the capitalist world, which was the United States. And we saw that because of the rivalry with the communist world, it demanded a lot of that the Western countries prioritized the security competition with the East. In other words, a lot of the economic competition within the West was mitigated exactly because of the military conflict. And also the main adversaries were communists, so they're largely decoupled from international markets. So this peace or political West, which we created, it existed under very specific conditions, which also required perpetuating the conflict. And we often saw this as well, not just in the West, but also with Japan. If someone got too close to the Soviets, too close to making a peace agreement, the threat was of peace breaking out, in which the alliance system is weakened. So this is why, once you have peace, you can't contain the adversary, and your allies will become less obedient, less loyal. And so this is why these peace alliances, they really require the perpetuation of conflict, something that Gorbachev also said towards the end to the Americans, that if we do bring an end to this Cold War, we have to understand the ramifications. The whole power structures would start to come apart. So it wasn't sure if the Western side was quite ready for this. And I think, he was probably correct on that point.
So the point that you're making is the U.S. became the dominant country, of course, in the North Atlantic region. It created NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to be the military alliance to confront the Soviet Union. And the U.S. was definitely by far first among equals. You can't even say equals. It was the dominant power by far. But part of that dominance, which the U.S. came to like, depended on essentially the ongoing fear of the other. And so a kind of perpetual war environment actually builds dominance within your side of the conflict. And the Cold War, in that sense, played into the U.S. power-seeking hands. what impresses me about the Cold War, the more I've come to understand the specific events. When I learned about the Cold War as a student decades ago, I was told that Stalin was a madman, that he was ruthless, that he wanted to take over the world. And so the United States reluctantly had to take the mantle and defend Europe and to defend the free world against international communism. The more I grew up and the more I saw, one of the striking things about the Cold War is that the US, Soviet Union, and UK were allies during World War II. They jointly defeated Hitler, but that alliance fell apart, not even years afterwards or even based on what the Soviet Union did, but rather by the middle of 1945, weeks after the end of the fighting in Europe. Already Churchill was envisioning maybe we'll have a war with Russia or with the Soviet Union, Operation Unthinkable, which got batted down as unworkable. But there was already talk in Britain of why don't we go to war next with our ally that we just allied with for many years to defeat Hitler. And in the US, the powers that were already there and that came to dominate the US were virulently anti-Soviet from the first moment. In fact, many had large business dealings with Germany and were actually not even antagonistic to the Nazi regime for a long period of time. The famous case of the Dulles brothers. One became the head of the CIA in the 1950s, the other became the Secretary of State, and they were lawyers in a law firm that represented large German corporations right during the Nazi period. And at the end of 1945 of the fighting in Europe, they reverted to a rabid anti-Soviet attitude before, in my view, the Soviet Union had actually done anything to justify that. I wonder what your view of that is, because you obviously studied this intensively.